Okay, thank you everyone for coming tonight. My name is Levi Zitting, as Mike had mentioned, and I'm here. I run the .NET user group. This is the .NET user group presentation for tonight. One quick announcement I actually forgot. If you are interested in speaking at one of these events, the .NET user group is looking for speakers to start filling out 2022 with. So if you have a topic even tangentially related to .NET, we're not talking about .NET very much tonight. We are talking about something made by Microsoft, so I consider that related enough. So if there's anything like that you've been interested in giving a presentation on, definitely reach out to me on Discord or like through the Facebook group or whatever, and we'll be happy to accommodate you and get things all planned out. So looking for presenters for February onwards. All right, with that being said, let's dive into WSL. So I've broken this presentation down into 3 different parts. Part 1, what is WSL and why should you care? So we'll talk a little bit. I've already kind of explained what exactly it is, but I'll talk about some of the reasons why you would be even interested in a piece of tech like this. Part 2 will kind of be the longest part, and I might have to cut some of it short if we're crunched for time. But it's basically how do you install WSL and how do you use it. Some of this is going to be just kind of some basic Linux stuff. So if you're not super familiar with Linux, I'm going to try and explain most of the commands that I'm using and stuff like that. And feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'm totally fine with being stopped in the middle of my presentation. I got good notes to get me back on track. And then part 3 will be the more advanced side of it. How does WSL work? There's some good resources I'll point you to if you're really interested in truly understanding the architecture behind this, but I'll just kind of talk broadly about some of the way pieces of this piece of tech work, and hopefully kind of pull back the hood of what seems like magic when we get into it, so that you can understand exactly what's happening there. All right, so with that being said, I'll reiterate again, what is WSL? WSL, or the Windows Subsystem for Linux, is a feature that ships with Windows that allows you to run Linux from within Windows, side by side with Windows. It's not dual booting, if you've ever heard of dual booting, where you segment your hard drive into, or your storage device into a couple of different sections. You install Windows on one and Linux on the other, and when you turn your machine on, you get a pick. This is not that. It runs literally side by side, where you can have a Windows terminal here and a Linux terminal over here. So why should you care about this in the first place? Why as a developer would WSL even be interesting? So who here uses Windows normally? Imagine most of the people who decided to come, likely a lot of people on Windows. Now if you are using something like .NET, the story of getting set up with .NET on Windows is great. It's a nice little Visual Studio installer, you're good to go. The story for other tech stacks, like PHP, Python, even Node sometimes, is a little hairy and not the best, and it's kind of complicated. Every time I've tried to set one of those things up on Windows, I have to relearn it all over again, and it takes a few hours. And the real reason behind that is that these tools were natively developed for Linux. And so running Linux allows you to kind of take the easy route in installing these developer applications and these developer libraries. So that's one big plus for having access to Linux, is just ease of setting up developer tooling. Another, and this is a big opinion of mine, I'm sure there's plenty of people that disagree out there, but the Linux command line is just easier to use versus some of the terminal applications on Windows like PowerShell or Command Prompt. Don't get me wrong, PowerShell is actually really, really powerful if you're an IT administrator, but if you are a developer, it actually kind of gets in the way. At least to me, it does. And so having access to that Linux terminal is fantastic. It kind of makes a lot of stuff easier, and also just for me, those commands are much easier to remember and use than some of the ones on like PowerShell. And to some extent, you don't have to look far to find evidence that even Microsoft kind of agrees with that. A lot of the basic Linux commands like listing files and making directories are available as the Linux commands in PowerShell because they realize that those are so great. But there's plenty that aren't there, and so having just access to a full-blown Linux command line is really powerful. Another one that you might not be thinking about, but the majority of servers on the internet as a whole run Linux. And if you are a developer, chances are you're writing some software that's going to get shipped onto a server, especially if you're doing anything with the web. And so having access to Linux in your development environment means that you are now that much closer to matching production. And I cannot tell you how many times I've shipped a bug to production because my environment was different. Something about backslashes, forward slashes, different in file paths, things of that nature, just like it works on my machine, but then it doesn't work when you go to production. And so just that fact that, especially if you're like a web developer, like I was talking about, that fact that it can bring your development environment that much closer to production provides a lot of value, helps you ship less bugs, that whole thing. So hopefully you can see kind of the value that having access to Linux could provide. For those of you who maybe have gone down this road before, you might be asking, why don't I just run Linux natively? Like why don't I just wipe my machine and install Ubuntu on there and go from there? Or why don't I dual boot? Those are both options. For me, one reason to try and keep Windows is Windows has a lot of great desktop apps. The Office suite, not available on Linux. There's some kind of open source alternatives, but they're not nearly as good. Even just something simple as finding a good email client. I keep all my email addresses logged into the same client. There's always been a chore on Linux to find one that's great. Outlook is fantastic on Windows, along with a billion other versions. And so, to me, being able to still have access to all the Windows apps and not have to go back to Linux, and not have to like power off my machine to go back into Windows to have access to those is really valuable. Also, if you're a gamer, like you get to install your games. Linux gaming is still a big, it's okay. It's not amazing. So those are some reasons why you would actually want to dig into a piece of tech like WSL that provides the ability, it gives you access to Linux without having to jump through those hoops like dual booting or wiping your machine and just running Linux or something like that. Okay, so how do we get WSL and how do we use it? So I have a virtual machine set up here on my computer, and I'll do most of the work in here so I have as clean a slate as possible. Hopefully it's like basically almost identical to what you would get if you just fresh installed Windows on your computer. Step one to getting WSL, I can't easily show you in a presentation. And so I'm going to just kind of tell you about it, and hopefully you'll be able to find some guides on how to get through this. But essentially, you have to change some BIOS settings on your device. And I'd have to power off my machine. And also, even if I did show you, it's different for every computer. The general gist is you power off your machine. When it's turning on, it tells you to push some key to enter setup or to enter BIOS. Once you're in there, the option you're looking to turn on is normally under something like virtualization. You need to ensure that your BIOS has virtualization enabled in order to run WSL. If you don't see an option in there, you likely can't use WSL. But normally if you don't see an option there, it's likely because it's hidden under something else. So look a little deeper, try and find a guide for your specific device on how to get access to that. Now, assuming that you have virtualization enabled, and you're like me, you're booted up into a machine, you're ready to rock and roll, step one is to turn the feature on. This is an optional feature in Windows. It isn't enabled by default. So I'm running Windows 11 here, but almost all of these steps will work on Windows 10 as well. So I'm going to open up my Start menu, and I'm just going to search Features. And there's this little Turn Windows Features On or Off result that comes up. I'm going to open that. And when it is ready to do its thing, there we go. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and there's two options in here that I need to enable. Number one is Virtual Machine Platform, and it looks like I already have this machine in a state where I had already turned these on. But you would click this little box for Virtual Machine Platform, and you would also click this one for Windows Subsystem for Linux. After you hit OK, it'll download some files and then reboot your machine. Once that is done, you are ready to install a Linux distribution. For those of you, or a Linux distro for short. For those of you who aren't familiar with how the Linux world works, there are a lot of different versions of Windows made by different people and different teams with different opinions and different default settings and different default apps. There's a handful of really popular ones. I'm going to be using one tonight called Ubuntu. It's one of the most widely used ones. It's also the one I'm the most familiar with. But if you have a preference for a certain distribution, you can install that distribution in WSL as well, most likely. It isn't as simple as just going straight to whoever made the distribution and downloading all the install files. There's a special way you got to go about it. And and that distro actually has to add support for WSL, but for the most part, all the main distributions that you'd be interested in are available. So how do you go download one of these distributions? Surprisingly enough, you open up the Microsoft Store. For anyone who's known Microsoft for a while, this is going to be kind of crazy that you would go to Microsoft's proprietary store to download Linux. If you're familiar with the opinions of Steve Ballmer, he is like going crazy right now. But I will just search Ubuntu. Oh, I spelled that wrong, didn't I? Ubuntu. And this first result here is an app called Ubuntu. And I've already installed it. I didn't have this machine in just the right state. But basically, once you install it, you will open it up, and it's an app installed on your machine. So here is Ubuntu. OK, I'm actually going to power this off, and I'm going to run through this process one more time so that you guys can see the whole thing end to end, because there is some stuff that will come up. So let me just apply this checkpoint and reboot this thing. All right. Thought I had reset it beforehand, but I guess I didn't. OK, here we go. So now if I go to features, that should be turned off. If it isn't, we'll just roll with it. Features. And turn Windows features on or off. If I scroll down, OK, those are turned off now, so I'm in the right state. So I'm gonna select virtual machine platform and Windows Subsystem for Linux. And before I hit OK there, I'm also just at the same time going to go back to the store and download that from there. So if I go to Ubuntu and I'll click this big Get button right here. I'll click OK back in here. It'll do its thing. This should only take, we have some pretty fast internet here, so this likely should take maybe 30 seconds to a minute. Yeah, it's already almost finished applying these changes. Your mileage may vary on the speed here. I'm going to wait to restart this computer. And as soon as this is done, I'll reboot, and you can see the whole process end to end. So now we'll restart. And you do have to restart after you turn those features on, the virtual machine platform and the Windows Subsystem for Linux. I should be able to reconnect now. OK, it's doing its thing. Get me full screen. Oh, come on. Let's try reconnecting. Perfect. OK. So now if I open up my Start menu, I have this app called Ubuntu that's installed on my machine. I'll go ahead and launch this. And it says that it's installing, but then it hit a snag. And you'll likely see this, too, if you're following along. There is an update to WSL that you need to manually install to get all this to work. So I'm going to copy that URL that they printed to the console. I'm going to go visit it. And it links me directly to this little link, WSL to Linux kernel update. And I'll run through this installer really quick. It's pretty simple, just next, yes, finish, and you're done. And then I'll close this Ubuntu app, and I'll start it up one more time. So Ubuntu, and it says that it's installing. It might take a few minutes. It normally doesn't take very long. And you can go ahead and close that now. You don't have time. You're doing fine. OK. For some reason, it hangs, and you have to like hit the Enter key at least once. So now it's asking you to set up a default username and password for the Linux distribution. This is different from like your Windows username and password, but I'll go with a pretty simple one. Just going to use my first name, and I'm just going to set the password to password. So it's easy enough to remember for tonight. And from here, it drops us in a Linux command line. This is the default prompt you get in an Ubuntu install. Now, you can continue to use this app that it provides to run all of your commands in. I prefer to use the new Windows Terminal app, which comes built into Windows 11. You can install it through the Microsoft Store with Windows 10. And it adds like tabs and stuff to the interface, which is super, super nice. But also, it automatically recognizes all the different like prompts that I can start on my machine. And it even just found Ubuntu. And so I can, from here, launch that Ubuntu environment again. And at this point, you're running WSL. So you can go crazy and start installing any kind of Linux software that you want. And I'm going to run through a few demos where I like install some common tools and like set up a project and like actually serve it and see what that looks like. The first thing I'm going to do, this is normally what I do when I'm in a brand new Linux environment, is I use the apt command to install any available updates. So I'm going to do sudo apt update. This will check for updates. And then I'm going to combine that with sudo apt upgrade to actually install those updates. And this part might take just a minute. While it's doing that, I'm going to go open up another terminal, and I'm going to talk about file system access. So you might notice, let me zoom in. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. So you might notice this directory. Normally when you are, if you're familiar with Ubuntu, normally you land in your home directory. By default, Windows Terminal is changing my default directory, but it does kind of show off something really important to understand. I am in Linux, but I am able to access all of the files that are in Windows. All those files are available in this /mnt, which is short for mount, /c. So if I actually go to that, cd/mnt/c, and I do a list here, you'll see like there's the Windows folder, and there's the users folder. Those are like, this is the root of my C drive that I have access to from within Linux. Now that's not the only thing you have access to. You also have access to a Linux file system. So if I cd to my home directory, which is shortcutted with the tilde, you'll see that I can go there, and if I type pwd, which is short for path to working directory, I'm in /home/Levi. So if I go to the very root, which is the equivalent of the root of your C drive, and list here, this is what you would expect in a brand new Ubuntu install. So setting up WSL, you now have two different file systems. You have the Linux file system and the Windows file system, but they can talk to each other really easily. So once again, to go back into Windows and access any file there and use Linux commands to alter that file, I can totally do that. I can go into mount/c/users, I think it's owner on this virtual machine, and I can cd into their like downloads folder. And I can list, okay, there's some of those things that I just downloaded. I can touch to create a file. So I'm going to create a little text file here. And if I go back into my Windows Explorer and I go into downloads, there's that little text file that I just created. So I can alter, update, do whatever I want with files between these two. Not only can I use Linux to make changes to Windows files, but I can also do the opposite. I can use Windows to change Linux files. So because I've added WSL, there's now this little Linux section in File Explorer. If I go open that, there's Ubuntu, and there is all of my Ubuntu install files. So the entire operating system lives in here. If I go to Home, there's my user folder. I can come in here. There's a few like hidden files that Linux hides by default, but I could come in here, and I could create a new text document and save that. And now if I go back in here and go to my home directory and list, we have hello.txt right there. So these two file systems are completely interoperable. With that being said, there are some caveats to be aware of. The performance of these file systems when you're accessing one from the other is very similar to what you'd get if you were accessing files over a network drive. And so you should be aware of that when you're running commands. If you need to make modifications to a lot of files, ideally, if you're sticking with the same OS on the same file system, that will always be fast. But if you use a Linux tool to go change a ton of Windows files, that might be a lot slower. So that's something to be aware of. But you at least still have access to all those. You can easily copy things back and forth, all that good stuff. So back in here, of course, it's waiting for me to say yes, so that is not done yet. The other thing that I'll point out is in File Explorer, if I go back to Linux and I go to Ubuntu, and I double click up here in the address bar, this is what the path looks like to my Ubuntu install. It's hard to see, but it's // wsl.localhost / the name of my the name of my distro that I'm using. And so you can use that path in shell scripts or something on the Windows side to access files in WSL. So anytime you're doing that access, that's what your path will look like, whereas on the Linux side, the path is /mnt/c. Okay, and this is almost done. Also, while it's doing that, there's some other stuff I can go show off too. This one blew my mind when I saw it. When you're in Linux, you can actually run commands that are normally only available in Windows. So, for instance, ipconfig is the command in Windows to check your networking information. So from within Linux, I can actually run that command and get its output printed in my terminal. So if I say ipconfig and then add .exe to the end, that ran ipconfig back in Windows and piped its output into my Linux terminal. And what's even cooler than that is I can take that output and I can combine it with other Linux commands. So some of you may have heard of Grep, which is a tool that takes the output from one command and takes the output of one command and searches for a specific string of text within that command and shows you what lines it was on. So if I say ipconfig.exe and then I use the pipe operator to send that input from ipconfig over to grep, and I search for something like IPv4 and push enter here, grep was able to identify the content in that output and print it here. So I can run any Windows command that's in my Windows path from within here. I want to edit a text file in Notepad, notepad.exe test.txt. And I'll have it create that file. I'll go ahead and add some content and save it. Works totally fine. I'll use the cat command in Linux to print out the contents of that text file. There's the text that I just saved. If I want to use, like if I want to open the current folder in like Windows Explorer, I can do explorer.exe and then pass in like the current directory. That opens Windows Explorer directly to where I was directly to the path I had open back in Linux. So hopefully you can see that this is kind of one reason to not do a dual boot approach, because you can literally mix and match. Whatever command has all this power on Windows, you can use that to make modifications directly in your in your Linux files, or pipe that output to other commands. So this interop is a really powerful feature that WSL has. Okay, it looks like all of our updates are installed. So I think I'm ready to do a couple demos. So the main demos that I have, like I said, we're running through some kind of common tools that you would install as a developer. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's install Node.js. Let's see what that process is like. Who here has gone through the install process to get Node.js on Windows? Okay. You remember you download this little installer, you hit next a few times, it has to install like the Visual Studio build tools, it has to install Python or something like that. It's got a ton of stuff that it has to come with. On a slower machine, that whole process can take like 15 minutes. Like it takes a while. It opens several prompts in different windows. It's a little bit of a nightmare. In Linux, let me go copy the command I have to do it. It's two commands. This first one essentially is telling apt, the command we use to install software. The script that I'm downloading here with this command updates apt to know where to go find the latest version of Node. So kind of a little complicated, but a single command, so not the end of the world. So if I run this, it does it checks for updates again to make sure that it found everything, and then I should be able to just say sudo apt install node.js, and it'll ask me if I do want to install it. I guess it just went ahead and did it. Normally it gives me a prompt there, but oh well. So now if I type node-v, I get node 16. npm-v, it's there. Those were not there. I should have tested to make sure that I wasn't like trying to pull a fast one here. But Node is available there. Let's go back into the home directory and let's let's use Notepad to create a little JavaScript program. So notepad.exe script.js, and yes, we'll have it create it. And we'll just go ahead and say console.log hello from Node. And I'll save this file and exit. And then we'll use Node to run that script. And it prints console log to the console. So 2 commands. to install Node on Linux versus all of that setup you had to do and all those additional tools you had to install on Windows. The other thing I was going to run through is setting up a LAMP stack. Yeah, go ahead.
So can you access Node on the Windows stuff?
No, that's a good question. Node is not installed. I cannot open PowerShell and run Node at this point. So if I open up PowerShell and I say node -v, it's going to say it can't find the command. Yes, it can't find the command. With that being said, I totally skipped over this earlier when I was talking about the interop between the two. You can use the Wsl command in PowerShell or command prompt, and then the name of a Linux command to get it to run, do that interop that happened with the notepad.exe and ipconfig. You can use this to make it happen back in Windows. So you kind of can if you prefix it with Wsl. Now, I can use Node to make changes to files in Windows if I wanted to from within Linux. So I can go into mount c users owner, and if I created a JavaScript file here, I could use Node to run that script file. Node will be able to load that just fine from Windows and use it. But you can use Node back in Windows, in a Windows command prompt, by prefixing it with Wsl. OK. OK, yeah, so the next demo was, how are we doing on time? We're doing fine. So the next demo was going through and setting up a LAMP stack. So this is like PHP, MySQL, getting all that running. On Windows, this process isn't terrible. Lots of times if you go download like XAMPP, it'll kind of get you there. Some of the other ways that I've installed it by like using, what is it, Choco is like Chocolatey is like a popular package manager on Windows. That makes it pretty easy to install PHP, but then it's missing like some really important extensions for some project types. So specifically, what I had planned to go through is setting up a basic Craft CMS project. Craft CMS runs on the LAMP stack, and it requires some kind of unusual extensions. Not that unusual, but just like out of the ordinary from some of the other PHP stacks. Like it needs the ImageMagick extension, or Imagick extension. To get that on Windows, huge pain. You got to go download this zip file with a bunch of DLL files in there and go put those in the right place. And you might have done it wrong, and it's totally borked if you did it wrong. It's a huge, huge pain. So we're going to run through. We're going to start by installing MySQL, and then we'll install PHP, and then we'll run through and install Composer, the tools you need to run Craft CMS. So for MySQL, the command is sudo apt install MySQL server. OK? It needs a password. All right, this shouldn't take too long. I'll just wait for it here for a second. And almost there. This is one of the ones that takes the longest, so it should be smooth sailing from here on out. Excuse me. And OK, so now we just have to start it up. So sudo etc init.d MySQL start. And normally, if you just kind of Google how to install MySQL on Linux, these are the commands that are going to come up. So I run this. It'll start the MySQL server. And then from there, I can say sudo MySQL to log in and get a MySQL prompt here. So now I can actually start executing MySQL code, like queries against my database server. I'm going to go copy a couple quick commands to, I don't like having to log in as the root user all the time, so I like to set up another user that has basically the permission to create databases and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to copy this. And I also like it to be the same name as my actual like Linux user, because then I can just type MySQL and get to this prompt. I don't have to do sudo, which I forgot to mention what that command does to anyone who's new to Linux. Sudo is kind of the equivalent of running as admin. Normally, if you have to go launch an admin PowerShell, sudo is doing kind of the same thing without having to launch a whole new terminal or anything like that. So I'll run these quick commands. It's asking if I want to paste multiple lines. I do. and run those, and it's done. It created a user without a password. It gave it all the privileges on all the databases. So now if I get out of this and I just type MySQL, it tries to log in as Levi at localhost, which that's my localhost is my MySQL's server name. And so I get right in it. It's a little bit easier without having to type the whole thing out. OK, so now getting PHP, this is another command that I'm going to go grab because it's kind of long, but it's pretty easy to understand. So let me go back and copy this guy. So this command is installing all of these packages. So it's installing PHP. It's installing another unrelated package called unzip. Composer needs this package, so I'm just doing it here. And then I'm installing a bunch of extensions, including like PHP Imagic and PHP MySQL and all those other extensions that don't always come with every PHP installation. And I'll run this, push yes, and in 20 seconds, it'll be done, and that's all I have to do. To some of you that I've helped set this kind of stuff up on Windows, hopefully this is looking a lot easier right now. Then the last thing that I need to do is go copy one more command to go get Composer. The way Composer wants you to install their thing on Linux is just by running some PHP commands. So if I go to download, they want you to run each of these commands to kind of download the installer and set it up and remove the installer. And they want you to run these all as separate commands. I just have combined them all into one, so it runs really smoothly. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this command and paste this. And one more to go move it. This last command, it creates this composer.far file, which is actually like Composer itself. And this command just moves it to a directory that will be globally available, so I don't have to be in this folder to run that program. So if I paste this, now I should be able to do php-v, and I got php 7.4, and I should be able to do composer --version, and I have Composer. That setup process took me like 5 minutes. Now I did have the commands ready, to be fair, but even if I had all these installers downloaded on my machine in Windows, I'd still be setting up MySQL right now, probably. It just takes a little bit more time. It's not the smoothest installation experience. OK, the last thing I also want to do is I'm going to show off how to work with how to edit code that is in your Linux on the Linux side. So one of the best experiences of any editor out there is currently with Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to get that downloading in the background real quick while we go set up a craft project. So I'm going to just download Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go, let's see, to create a craft project, you use the composer create project command, and it is craft cms /craft, and then the name of the project.
Did you download VS Code on the Windows side?
Yes, that's a good distinction. I am downloading VS Code on Windows. I'm not installing anything in Linux yet. And in fact, I won't have to do it. It'll be pretty automatic. You'll see in a second here. OK, so Craft is wanting me to go through the install process. One thing I know I need to do is go create a MySQL database really quick. I'm going to do that in another tab, because Craft likes to store all of its content and stuff in a MySQL database. So we'll just create that really quick. Then back here, it's asking for if I want to run through the setup process. I'll say yes. I'm using the MySQL driver. That is the IP of my local MySQL server. That's the port. This is the username. It doesn't have a password. The database name is Craft, and there is no table prefix. And if it's asking if I want to install it, which means it's going to go set up all the database tables and stuff like that, along with a default admin user. So I'll go ahead and add admin, use my personal email address, and I'll just set password to password. No one hack this local site, please. And I'll just fill in some dummy stuff for the site name and site URL, and the site language will be English. All right, this will take a few seconds to go through and create all these tables in the MySQL database. So while that's doing its thing, I'm going to go back to Windows and finish this VS Code installation process. So I'll launch the executable. I'll accept the agreement. Next, 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 install. Okay. It's still doing its thing. And we will launch VS Code. Okay, so now we have VS Code. It's all installed. The main thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to extensions, and I'm going to install the Wsl extension. And I will click the install button on this extension. This part is pretty important. Make sure that you go download this extension. And we'll come back to VS Code in a second. Let's go back to, actually no, let's just do it right now. I will have to relaunch my terminal after installing VS Code for this next part to work. So let me go back to the Windows terminal, launch Ubuntu, go to my home directory, zoom in a little bit. So normally when you install VS Code, you get a command back in your Windows prompts, just simply code. And you can use that to launch VS Code from your terminal. And you can also pass it like a folder name to open up that folder or open up that file in VS Code. I'm going to use that command to open up my site directory, the craft project. I'll go ahead and run this. WSL takes over this command, and it starts installing this VS Code server package. I'll explain what that is in a second. I'll let it run through its installation. And now we have VS Code launching here. Yes, I trust the authors of this. I made it. And here we have all of those files and folders that are in our Linux side. They're not in Windows at all. And we can edit these. We can delete them. We can move them around. We can do whatever we want. And if I do Control tilde to open up, that's the shortcut to open up your terminal in VS Code, I have my Ubuntu terminal right here, not like PowerShell or anything like that. So this is what the Wsl extension is doing, is it's updating my default terminal and also letting me efficiently view those files that are in WSL. A quick rundown of kind of how VS Code is architected and how this is possible and what's happening under the hood. You might not know this, but VS Code is actually just a web app. It runs in this Electron wrapper, which Electron is just a piece. It's essentially Google Chrome without the tabs and stuff, and it loads a web page that is your app, right? And VS Code has stuck to a very heavy client-server model, so that all the code for displaying the UI and accepting user input and displaying the text from files, all that code is separate from the code that actually like loads files and saves them to disk and modifies files and all that kind of stuff. And so what the VS Code team has done is they've created a separate package called VS Code Server that you can install literally on a server out in the cloud somewhere and have your VS Code running on Windows connect into it. And that server will just send really efficient pieces of data, the bare minimum you need to like build up a file tree and load those files without having to like send everything directly into it. And essentially that same piece of tech is what's being used here. VS Code Server is running in the WSL side, in the Linux side, and is efficiently telling VS Code about what files and folders there are. And then the UI sends commands into the server to say, hey, update this file, here's the new version, or things of that nature. And so working in this is super seamless and really, really fast too. You won't notice any kind of like slowdown necessarily in opening up files, even with a ton of stuff in there, like you might if you were using like a network drive. Question, yes? I have not tried debugging, but from what I've heard, it does work. I am not sure. I don't have a demo prepared for how to get debugging work, but I'm pretty sure there's a way to make debugging work through WSL. Any interpreter you're using for whatever language, you're going to be running the code with the interpreter that's back in the Linux side. And so whatever mechanism that interpreter or whatever language it is you're running has for doing some kind of debugging, I'm pretty sure the WSL extension is able to take advantage of that and get remote debugging working. I've heard the VS Code team talk about VS Code Server a lot, and I know that like debugging is always something that they're mentioning. So I can't remember exactly, but I feel really confident that it does work. Good question, though. OK, so the other thing I wanted to show off really quick is we have our craft project, right? My site. Craft ships with its own little command line, like its own CLI utility to perform all sorts of various actions in the system. One of those is to just start up a little web server and serve the project. So PHP craft serve. And it says that it's running on localhost 8080 inside of the Linux operating system. But if I open this up in, oh man, it's going to open in Edge. I was hoping to avoid that. If I copy this so I don't have to do it in Edge, and I go to Chrome in Windows, it loads just fine. So the WSL team is essentially mapping networking ports from the Linux side back to the Windows side so you can load any content. That MySQL server that's running in WSL, if I have a database client installed in Windows to go view all that data and all those tables, I can use that to access that database. I don't have to do it through Linux. And the last thing that I'll do is I'll just go show that communication with the database is actually working. If I go to the admin page and I type in those credentials, that's all working. There's like, in Craft, there's a utilities section you can go to and get information about the system. And all of the PHP extensions, there's something about MySQL time zone support that's not turned on. I'm pretty sure you have to just import some data for that. There's one PHP option I didn't go enable to increase the max execution time, but the PDO extension is here. The GD extension or ImageMagick extension is here. All that just worked just from that one command I had ran to install PHP and all of those other extensions. So that's the last of the demos. Now I want to talk about a couple other just kind of things I don't really have a demo prepared for, but deserve somewhat of an explanation. Number one is Docker. If any of you use Docker, traditionally when you install Docker on Windows, it sets up, I believe it does it in Hyper-V, which is the one, or I'm pretty sure you can also do it with VirtualBox. You can likely choose. It'll essentially set up a virtual machine to install Linux into and run all of your code in that Linux virtual machine. One of the big downsides to that is I believe it cut off the ability for Windows home users to actually use Docker because of that need for a virtual machine. I don't think that Windows home users can do virtualization. I could be wrong about that, but if I remember right, that's the problem. WSL 2 does work in Windows 10 Home and Windows 11 Home as well. Docker now allows you to use WSL as the backend for that Docker operating system that it needs to set up, which means that you can now use Docker with Windows 10 Home. And also, no need for a fully separate virtual machine. It's able to just work right alongside all this WSL stuff. So it's a lot faster to boot up and has a lot of other things that are kind of nice about it. But be aware that Docker has this feature, and it's optional as well. You can turn it off so that it will go still set up the full-blown virtual machine if you'd want that. Don't really know why you'd want that, because it is a lot faster to use it in WSL. The other thing that's really interesting, this is in preview right now. This isn't available natively, but there is a way to get Linux apps that have a user interface to actually work and show up as a window that you can see next to your other windows. This is, like I said, in preview. It's also only available for users with Windows 11. It's not available in Windows 10. But essentially, to get access to install a GUI-based application like Nautilus, which is a file manager for Linux, you can install that and open it up and let it view all of your Linux files. To get it, all you do is the actual project for doing these Linux GUI apps is called WSLG. And if you go to the repo for WSLG, they talk about some prerequisites. The main thing is installing a compatible graphics driver that supports WSL. So if you have, depending on what kind of GPU you have, you'll download that and run it. And that's only if you want hardware, what's the term I'm thinking of? Hardware accelerated rendering of everything. So if you're doing anything graphically intensive, definitely look at getting those drivers installed. From that point, you just install something with a GUI, and it'll install any other dependencies it needs to kind of mimic a desktop environment. It doesn't install a full-blown desktop environment like it would if you were running on actual Linux. But you can then just launch them. They'll actually show up in Windows as like a registered app that you can launch from your start menu. Like I said, it's in preview mode. It's got some rough edges. Having it work with display scaling really sucks right now. Everything either looks really small or way too big, because it can't do what they call fractional scaling, where the window is scaled to 1.75 times the resolution of the display you're on. So some stuff like that isn't great. It also doesn't work with window snapping in any way, which can cause, it's a little bit annoying. Although there are at least a few shortcuts to like maximize the window and stuff like that. But it's still absolutely insane that it even works. Also, like sound works with these apps as well. So you can install VLC in WSL and play a media file, and it'll just work. Now, a couple limitations. It's not all rainbows and butterflies here. There's some parts that suck about WSL. One of the first that I ran into was WSL has no support for attaching a USB device. And where that really got to me was any type of like Android development. You can install all the Android SDKs on Linux, but plugging in a device and doing USB debugging is impossible. Now, I say it's impossible. There is some workarounds in some discussions on the WSL repo, where some people are able to get like USB over IP working. I have not gone down that rabbit hole. I'm not sure what kind of performance that you'd run into, or I'm sure there's all sorts of stuff that could go wrong using that kind of thing. But that's something to be aware of. No USB devices at all. If you want to do some like low-level hardware hacking or whatever, and use some Linux tools to, flash some little sensor you're working with, you're not gonna have a good time. I talked about this earlier, but accessing the opposite file system, depending on the OS that you're on, is really slow. It's something to be aware of. If you want to use Node to do an npm install in your Windows directories, that's going to be painful and really slow, and you probably shouldn't do it. You should just go ahead and install Node back on the Windows side. Another one that kind of tripped me up a little bit is most Linux distributions ship with what is called an Init Daemon, which is essentially a piece of software that runs when the system boots and starts up any system services. WSL totally takes over everything about the boot process, so you don't have one of those things. Normally on Ubuntu, it's called systemd, and it'll do things like automatically starting up your database servers when your machine reboots. None of that is available. So you either have to just kind of manually start those services when you need them, or you have to, there's a project out there called Wsl Auto Start that helps you set up a script that'll run as soon as your machine boots that will start any of those services in WSL for you. Wsl Auto Start. Yeah, this guy right here. So there's some workarounds, but it does kind of suck that it's not just seamless and that they don't have another solution. Let's see, we got a few more minutes, so I can do I can go a little bit into part 3, but I want to stop real quick and give a chance for anyone to ask any questions they have. Is there anything in the chat, Tiffany? Okay, cool. All right. So this part will be pretty short, because if I was to really dive into it, it'd take like 4 hours, and I also don't really know all that much about it. But I am decently familiar with kind of the layout of the LAN when it comes to architecture and what exactly they're doing to make all these integrations work so well. So most of the information I'm about to talk about comes from a talk available on YouTube. Let's go find this. WSL architecture. This talk right here from Microsoft Developer, the Windows Subsystem for Linux Architecture. And I'm actually going to pull up a screenshot from this talk to kind of finish out the rest of this. So Windows, or WSL architecture. So one thing to be aware of is that there's 2 versions of WSL, WSL 1 and WSL 2. WSL 1 was released back in like 2016, I believe. And it's been around for a while, and I think in 2019, they announced WSL 2, which was quite the departure from version 1. So before talking about version 2, I want to talk about what version 1 was and how it worked. So let me find the image in question here. This works. So let's open image in a new tab. Okay. So, oh, this is how version 2 works. Darn it. Is there another screenshot that talks about version 1? This one kind of does. OK. So this is kind of like a rough diagram of how WSL version 2 worked. So, or sorry, WSL version 1. So the Linux distributions themselves don't have a lot of low-level code, I would say. I mean, I'm sure that they do. But as far as I understand, kind of the way that a distribution works is it talks to the Linux kernel. This is the core part of Linux that actually is working directly with the hardware. And the Linux kernel makes these system calls available to the distro and all the other applications that it may have installed. They call it userland pretty commonly. And so applications in userland will make those syscalls, these like function calls down into the kernel to do things like open a file, start a new thread, close a file, those kinds of things. And in Windows, Windows also has a kernel. They call it the Windows NT kernel, and it performs a very similar function, but those system calls are very different between Linux and Windows, both like in like their names and what they're capable of, but also just like how they behave. Some of the behavior is just fundamentally different. What WSL version 1 did is it added this layer in between the distro that acted like it was the Linux kernel, but whenever it received one of those system calls, it would rewrite it on the fly to be a Windows system call, a Windows NT kernel system call. And this worked decently well. The problem is there are hundreds of syscalls available, and the WSL team wasn't able to implement all of them due to time and also just due to the fact that Windows and Linux are fundamentally different, and some of them couldn't actually be made available. So there was the software support for like pieces of Linux software was hit or miss. Some programs worked flawlessly, while others, they would blow up and die when this certain system call was missing. WSL2 replaces this with what Microsoft calls a lightweight utility VM. So it is a virtual machine, but it's different than a traditional virtual machine. Traditional virtual machines, they have to set aside a certain amount of resources. They can take a while to actually like boot up and get started. And they're extremely closed off to the host operating system, right? This lightweight utility VM technology allows it to boot much quicker, within a second most of the time. And it uses way less resources. And it's because it's single-purposed. In fact, the technology that they're using, based on the WSL architecture talk that I pointed out, the technology that they're using was created by Microsoft to run in their Azure data center to try and make more efficient virtual machines in Azure. And they've taken that same piece of tech and ported it to the desktop here and set up this little lightweight utility VM. One thing that's really interesting is that this utility VM doesn't talk to the Windows kernel at all. The Windows kernel is actually sitting on its own hypervisor, and the lightweight utility VM talks directly to that hypervisor. It no longer has this layer of having to go through the Windows kernel and translate any system calls. There's no system calls to actually translate, because in that utility VM, you have the actual Linux kernel. And what happens is Microsoft ships a version of the Linux kernel with Windows. We actually had to install an update for it really early on. That little file we had to go download when we hit an error when installing, that was an update to that Linux kernel. And that utility VM has one Linux kernel with all of the various distributions, which I did kind of forget to mention that. You can install more than one distro. You can install Ubuntu, you can install CentOS or whatever and have them run side by side. They both run on top of that same Linux kernel. And so performance in Linux is comparable to what you'd get if you just installed it directly on the hardware, which is really, really cool. Then what Microsoft has done is both the Linux VM and the Windows side both have file servers running on them that can talk to each other. And that's how we get this great interop between files on Windows and files on Linux. They show up as like these mounted or network drives. And then there's kind of some special stuff they're doing that I'm not super familiar with, but they're kind of taking control over standard in and standard out on both operating systems in order to get those commands to work with each other. And then something is happening for the port mapping. That part didn't actually exist when they originally gave that talk. At least I don't think it did. So I'm not totally sure how they're making that happen, but this is the general idea. The stuff that's running in WSL is a very lightweight virtual machine. And because of that, all the software that's available on Linux works right out of the box. They don't have any of this kind of patchiness of, here's some of these system calls work, some of these work, all the system calls work now, which is super, super great. The main downside that came with WSL version 2 was the file system performance between those two. But ultimately, it's kind of a pretty decent trade-off to make, considering that most of the time you can actually keep all the files you're working with directly in the Linux side, where everything is super, super fast. So that kind of sums up the architecture and kind of how WSL2 works. Any questions? OK. Go ahead.
So if you're running a Windows machine and you start using WSL, how much does it increase your hardware demand?
Sure. So that's a good question. Let's measure it really quick. So I didn't shut down the virtual machine yet. So I'm going to make sure that I have WSL completely shut down. And so let's open Task Manager. And let's go look at our memory usage after I open up the terminal. And I'm going to use the WSL -- shutdown command, which will stop that VM from running. OK, it shouldn't be running at all now. So if I go to Performance, Memory, so we're using 3.3 gigs right now. If I just launch this tab to start up Ubuntu, and right there. So it used about 400 megs of RAM to have the WSL instance running. Now, on Linux, there's a terminal command you can use to look at current system usage. It's called htop. If I run this, the Linux VM thinks it has 8 gigs, but it's only using 500, 400, or whatever. That's how much it sets aside right away. That amount will grow over time up to the limit that it's telling that Windows is telling the OS that it has. It looks like the default is half of your available system memory. So this virtual machine has 16 gigs of RAM, and so it defaulted to roughly 8. So yeah, not very much resources at all. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any others?
Do you know what happens if usage on the Ubuntu side were to spike?
It'll cap out at whatever that limit was, 8 gigs, and you would notice Windows starts to slow down probably, although it is capped at only half your memory, so it's not going to completely tank performance. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. If you do have any questions later, feel free to ask them in Discord or find me afterwards. I'll be hanging around for a few minutes. But that was WSL2 and how to use it and how to get it set up.